Today's speaker, Nikhil Goyal, is a sociologist and author who earned his BA at Goddard College with his Master of Philosophy and PhD at the University of Cambridge. He served as a policy senior advisor on education and children for Chairman Senator Bernie Sanders on the U.S. Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions and Budget. He developed education, child care, and child tax credit federal legislation, as well as tuition-free college programs for the incarcerated. I'm sorry here, I have to change my page. And correctional workers in Vermont. He has taught sociology at New York University, the University of Vermont, and Wesleyan University. So I want to welcome Mr. Goyal to this.
Thank you so much, Don. It's such a great pleasure to be here. I just want to thank Don and Fred and Frank for all their work in bringing me here today and for this wonderful gathering. My name is Nikhil Goyal. As Don very graciously explained, I'm a sociologist and author of a recent book on child poverty. And I thought I'd talk for the next 30, 40 minutes about the book, some of the issues of the book, the crisis of child poverty, and where we go from here, because I think that's the latter piece is one that I think is very pertinent, especially in light of the election results on Tuesday. And then very open to having a robust Q&A with all of you and hearing your thoughts. All right. So I want to start by painting a little bit of a picture or a scene for you to describe the realities of life in the neighborhood of Kensington in the city of Philadelphia. As the bustling 47 Uptown bus leaves Society Hill, tree-lined cobblestone streets give way to Kensington's blocks of aging row homes, broken up by derelict shells of factories, copious needle-strewn lots, and poppy stores. Babies born in North Philadelphia's Kensington neighborhood are expected to live to the age of 71, 17 years less than the babies born no more than 4 miles away in Society Hill. And that is a lifespan on par with countries like Egypt and Bhutan and Uzbekistan. And I would argue that this is fundamentally the encapsulation of poverty as a death sentence. Philadelphia is the poorest large city in the United States, a hyper-segregated city where 1/3 of children are, quote, smothered in an airtight cage of poverty in the most affluent land on the planet, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once put it. These conditions may not be what comes to mind when people think of Philadelphia, often known as the birthplace of American democracy, the stage of the classic Rocky films, and the home of mouth-melting cheesesteaks at Reading Terminal Market. There's a great contrast between the neighborhood of Kensington and the neighborhood of Society Hill. Kensington is mostly poor and working class, predominantly Latino and African American, and suffers from toxic pollution while housing a billion-dollar open-air drug market. Society Hill is rich, mostly white, leafy, with eye-popping real estate values. And in one neighborhood in Kensington, children attend underfunded, overcrowded schools where they drink from lead-laced water fountains, play in gymnasiums caked with asbestos, and fall ill in classrooms with no heating. In the other neighborhood, in Society Hill, the children study in modern, safe schools that prepare them for the Ivy League, with small class sizes, well-paid teachers, counselors, psychologists, and librarians. In Kensington, children live in broken-down housing with mold and mice droppings, without hot water, and endure sudden evictions with less than 24 hours to pack up people's clothes, toys, and belongings and move into a homeless shelter or relative's dwelling. In Society Hill, the residents live in decent, secure housing with running water, heat, air conditioning, and high-speed broadband. So over the past several years, my research has been at the intersection of educational inequality, criminal justice, social welfare, and economic and racial inequities. I first came to Kensington in the year of 2015 when I started to visit an alternative last chance high school called El Centro de Estudiantes. El Centro works with young people who have dropped out, or more accurately, were pushed out of schools in Philadelphia. It is a big picture learning model school based on the principles such as educating the whole child, learning by doing, authentic exhibition style assessment, and restorative justice. Research would find that more than a quarter of Philadelphia youth aged 18 to 24 were disconnected, unemployed, and out of school. The figures were highest in the surrounding neighborhoods of El Centro. Nearly 40% of youth were disconnected, compared with downtown Center City, where only 10% were disconnected. Kensington is also the site of the largest open-air drug market on the East Coast, bringing together poverty, unemployment, the opiate epidemic, and despair in a devastating mix. So these are the conditions that these young people are confronting on a daily basis, just before they even get to the schoolhouse door. I interviewed hundreds of young people in Philadelphia, and for my book, Live to See the Day, I focused on three: Brian, Emmanuel, now known as Karem, and Giancarlos. And with everything stacked against them, they strive to do the impossible, to jettison the scarlet letter of dropout and become high school graduates. I also traced the lives of their mothers, Brainy, Yvette, and Marta. And together they tell the story of urban America over the past 50 years, from deindustrialization to the war on drugs, to welfare, to the end of welfare as we know it, to educational privatization. And I make the case that we cannot genuinely talk about the conditions of public education without accounting for poverty, housing insecurity, hunger, the lack of decent health care, mass incarceration, the opiate epidemic, and gun violence. So I start the book off with the story of Ryan Rivera. When he was in middle school, just a week shy of turning 13, he and a group of his friends were causing mischief in school. And they eventually dare each other to light pieces of paper on fire and then snuff them out with their sneakers. And so this goes on for several minutes in the school hallways. And they're lighting pieces of paper on fire. They're extinguishing the flame. But then one of them eventually dares Ryan to light a trash can on fire. And so Ryan, he had been somebody who's very who could easily succumb to peer pressure. Decides to light this trash can on fire and left the sheet of paper, the burning sheet of paper, in the can. And then eventually he has a change of heart, and then he goes back to the can and gets rid of the flame. But then they keep daring him. They keep trying to up the ante. They pressure him. They say, "Are you scared? Are you really scared to actually go through with this?" And then eventually he leaves one in the can burning, and the kids run away from the scene. Shortly thereafter, fortunately, a school employee locates what's happening and gets rid of the flame. And Ryan, for somebody who was a very profound troublemaker in school, decided to change his clothes and so that he wouldn't be identified on the school security cameras. But then when he gets to the school cafeteria at lunchtime, he is immediately apprehended by school administrators and the school resource officers, known as the school-based police officers. And he had been a troublemaker. He was always on the radar of the school administrators. And then he's hauled into a room with a bunch of other kids, and they start interrogating him. And they show the tape of the security footage. But they can't easily identify who's on the screen. It's kind of grainy footage. And then eventually Ryan, after several 10-15 minutes of questioning and interrogation, very hostile and aggressive questioning, he confesses. He says, "I'm the kid in the white t-shirt. I'm that child." Again, no parent or guardian, no lawyer, nothing. Just he's being questioned by these school officials. And then he eventually rats out the other kid who was with him at the time. And then that moment, that confession, leads to a spiraling series of events. And his life would never be the same again. The school decides to call the Philadelphia Police Department. Two officers come and they arrest him and another child. And when Ryan was telling me this story, I couldn't help but think about how different of experience he would have had he been perhaps white, or perhaps in, say, a suburban wealthy school, a school where they probably would have, they may have suspended him, they may have given him some detention, they would have, probably called his parents, and that would be the end of the story. There would be some reprimand, but the police would certainly never be called, especially since nobody, fortunately, was hurt. Nobody was hurt. And but so Ryan, he eventually gets taken to the one of the police districts in the city. He's plopped into a cell, the juvenile cell, with a bunch of other kids, and then he was under the assumption that eventually he would just be, his mom would come and take him home, but that was far from what ended up happening. He didn't have a chance to speak to his mother. He was funneled from the police district to the youth study center, which was the juvenile detention center in the city. Had not talked to his mother, and then went through the entirety of the juvenile justice system. So from the police district, he went to the youth study center. From the youth study center, he went to another juvenile detention center, Glen Mills, just outside of the city. And so he saw the full scope of what it was like to be a child criminalized and having run afoul of the law. And he when he was going through this process, there was one scene that he recounted to me in great detail that I think really encapsulated what this child had to endure, the humiliation that he endured. And so when he was back at the youth study center, he got his blood tests, he got a tuberculosis test, he got his vitals checked, and then mugshot, and then he was escorted to the shower room and by a guard, and the guard instructed him to remove all of his clothes. And when he had stripped down to his underwear and his socks, he said, "Do I have to take off my boxers?" And the guard replied in the affirmative. And Ryan protested. He said, "Come on, for real, in front of you?" And then the guard said, "Yes." And just as he was about to pull them down, the guard stopped him and handed him a towel. And he told Ryan to tie it around his waist and then take off his underwear. And after that, he made Ryan pick up each foot, wiggle his toes, followed by squatting and coughing so the guard could check him for drugs. And then when Ryan finished showering, he began examining the clothes that the guard had left for him. And the white briefs had skid marks. With his towel wrapped around his waist, he opened the door, held up the underwear, and said, "This shit is dirty as shit." And he said, and the guard shouted, "That's all we got." And Ryan pulled him on with a great sense of shame. So to me, that just shows how we treat particularly Black and brown children in this country, and the ways we criminalize and humiliate them in unnecessary and needless ways. And so Ryan goes through the juvenile system. He eventually ends up in court. The judge releases him into the care of his mother. It actually took him 2 to 3 days for him to actually speak to his mother. So just try to imagine a 12-year-old child in a completely unknown place with people who are with boys that are much older than him, not have no idea what his future holds, not even be able to speak to his mother. Just being scared and frightened out of his mind. So he comes back home. He is expelled from his middle school, Grover Washington, and now is transferred to what was known as an alternative for-profit disciplinary school called Community Education Partners. Community Education Partners, CEP, was a for-profit company. It was established in 1996 by a group of men who had ties to the Republican Party. And it had an early investment from a man named Thomas W. Beasley, the co-founder of the world's first private prison enterprise. And CEP eventually landed a contract with the Philadelphia schools. It started in Texas, the Houston schools, Dallas schools, and they began to export this model all over the nation. And so they started setting up these schools in Philadelphia, and they resembled prisons with draconian disciplinary measures, with dragnet surveillance, with restricted freedom of movement. And CEP's motto served to demonstrate the order of their priorities: be here, behave, and be learning. There were 2 airport-style metal detectors and 4 security guards at the male entrance of CEP, at least the school where Ryan attended. And they were pants, they went through the metal detectors, they were patted down, and then they were lined up against a wall with their hands behind their backs. And then they would have to walk with their hands behind their backs in a single file line into what was known as a community. And in those communities, not allowed to leave that area until the end of the day when they left school. These were segregated by gender as well as by grade. No backpacks, no school supplies, no cell phones, nothing. Just completely, just your uniform, yourself, and that was it. And so Ryan described to me what it was like to go to school in this environment. He talked to me about the constant fights and the very little learning that happened. These were students who had endured untold levels of structural violence. They had not been afforded any sort of rehabilitation or child-centered education or trauma-informed care or other really relevant resources that might help a child in this situation. Rather, the purpose of CEP was to efficiently surveil and warehouse members of what I call the educational untouchables, the children who were deemed threats to their classmates, to their school's academic performance, at least viewed by administrators, politicians, and criminal justice actors. And so Ryan would go through CEP, and every day when he came home from school, his mother, who was an incredible advocate for him, would take notes. And so I was able to look back at those notes, those journal articles from 2009, and be able to fully understand, or at least try to understand, what this young person had to go through each day. And so Ryan, he goes through the juvenile court system. He goes back to court a couple more times. The judge continues to order him to stay at CEP. But fortunately, to his great delight, CEP ends up closing that location where he had attended at the end of the school year. And for unknown reasons, which really we weren't able to determine, and he wasn't able to determine at the time, the judge ends up throwing out the case. And so after a couple months, after having gone through probation and CEP, he's free. And he returns to his middle school, and the school principal and the administrators at the school were completely in shock, because try to imagine all the bad kids, the troublemakers from CEP were now back at Grover, Washington. And so Ryan, he hadn't learned his lesson very much, and continued to engage in mischief and disciplinary actions while and disciplinary actions at school during 8th grade. And so I trace his life in the book from middle school to high school to coming to El Centro, and the kind of struggles and experiences this young person have going from school to school, the alienation, the lack of school engagement, his own challenges both at home and in learning environments, and trying to examine that through the lens of both agency as well as structure. And we have public policies, we have rules and procedures and systems that bear down on children, that affect the way they go about the world. And then we have agency, how they interpret those processes, how they resist that or contest it in those ways. And so one of the arguments I make in the book is in relation to this issue of the dropout crisis, or I would say the pushout crisis. And I argue that overcrowded classrooms, monotonous and irrelevant curriculum, the lack of engaging and extracurricular activities, punitive zero tolerance discipline, fighting and chaos, all of these things criminalize, alienate, disengage, and ultimately push young people out of school. And I look at it from the perspective of the school-based factors and conditions, and I also look at it from the position of political economy. What are the out-of-school issues that affect children that may disengage, alienate, criminalize, or push them out. And many of the children and families in my study lived in poverty. They received temporary assistance for needy families, TANF, supplemental security income, SSI, food stamps, SNAP, and other forms of public assistance. Another young person that I write about in the book is named Emmanuel. He lived with his disabled single mother named Yvette, and the family of two largely survived on roughly $10,000 a year in SSI and TANF benefits, plus food stamps. With this, Yvette had to cover housing, utilities, food, clothing, furniture, transportation, laundry, household goods, and other basic needs. She did this by pinching pennies, skipping meals, struggling to afford birthday and Christmas presents, and counting the days until the end of the month, only to start the process over and over again. She swallowed the humiliation of wearing tattered clothes, turning to food pantries, living in squalid housing, and moving over and over again. And so I tried to understand the effects that poverty and deep economic insecurity had on the life of Emmanuel, and how that affected his performance in school. He would talk to me about the different houses that he lived in, because they endure evictions. They often moved once or twice a year. One of the houses they lived in was on a street called Lippincott in North Philadelphia, and I had the opportunity to visit the street, and I could see the house. It violated virtually every basic housing code. Cockroaches, spiders, plump rats with long tails scurried about the house, finding their way into beds and cupboards. The floors were caked with dirt. The drywall was damaged. Mold festered in all the rooms. There was no electricity. So Yvette's boyfriend, Freddie, would take it from his nephew next door. The orange extension cords would snake through the upstairs window. The bathroom, smeared with urine and feces. The tub threatened to fall through the cracked ceiling into the kitchen. So try to imagine even trying to take a bath or a shower in that situation. They would take scary, chilly baths using buckets of water boiled on the stove. The tub shifting slightly when they stepped in it. This is the reality for millions of families across this country, the ones who live in dilapidated housing or insecure housing, housing with vermin and other rodents and infestation. And I began to try to understand what was it that what was it about this housing and the relationship that it had, at least the insecurity that it had on children's educational experiences. So Emmanuel would live through this and then have to go to school on a daily basis, and then come back to this type of environment. Just imagine trying to do homework or using the internet, or trying to even meet friends when you're in a kind of living condition like this. And then the other piece of the story was the fact that Emmanuel was questioning and grappling with his sexual identity and orientation. When he was very young, he preferred pink colors and playing with Barbies, and more quote unquote traditional feminine activities. And his mom would constantly get after him and tell him that you shouldn't be doing that, that's not what you're supposed to be doing as a boy. But as he grew older, he began to realize that he actually might be gay. And he lived in a Pentecostal Christian household. His mother was deeply religiously conservative. They'd bring him to church almost every day. And from the very beginning of his childhood, the thing that was drilled into him was that homosexuality is a sin. And so when he was in middle school, coming into high school, he would tell himself, he would ask God, "Can you pray the gay away?" That's what he would ask God, because he was so worried that God and his mother would reject him if he was actually gay. And one day he's in school And that was there was a moment that was the tipping point, the moment that just where he began to realize that he's going to have to come out to his mother, and life is not going to be the same again. And he had missed so much school, and he was making up a test. He was sitting in a classroom one day, and there were a couple teachers who were chatting in the corner, and this is 2012. And they're talking about the 2012 presidential election, and they're saying, one of them is saying, "Oh, I could never vote for Obama this time because he supports gay marriage." And here's this child who is questioning that he might be gay, overhearing this language in this conversation, and he had never felt more alone in his life. And he comes home from school a couple of days later, and he eventually confesses to his mother. He says, "I think I might be bisexual." He starts with that. He doesn't have the full bisexual. And his mother starts quoting something from the Bible, and a couple of passages, and then she asks him, she's worried that he might catch AIDS, and truly the kind of the worst things you can imagine when you're coming out to somebody in terms of what they could say to you. And so he goes through a period, very unfortunately, around suicidal ideation. He's completely alone. His father was very abusive to his brothers, and so he's out of the picture. The court has prevented his father from going anywhere near him or his brothers or his mother. As a matter of fact, he has very few friends, and his school is a more conservative institution where he doesn't necessarily feel that they would accept him if he came out. And then he has his mother, who is clearly not on his side. And so he goes through a period of suicidal ideation, but he finds solace in YouTube. He finds this YouTube channel called Davey Wadey, and they talk about the stories of queer youth coming out to their parents and their family members. And he begins to feel a little bit less alone. He begins to realize that what the suffering that I'm feeling at this moment may not be inevitable, that things may change down the road. And he eventually builds community online with others in the similar predicament that he is in. So in the book, I trace Emmanuel's life from this period of time to him coming to El Centro de Estudiantes. He literally just would bounce from school to school. He tried Esperanza charter school. He tried a virtual charter school. He eventually hears about El Centro through a friend of his who's a student at the school. And this becomes the first time in his life where he feels fully accepted. There's no uniform. You can wear whatever you want. There's El Centro small classes. You have a deep relationship between students and advisors. They're not called teachers; they're called advisors. There's democratic governance, school meetings where students talk about school rules and issues and conflicts, and other things happening. There's restorative justice. There are restorative specialists, one on each floor of the school, that help you manage the trauma or conflicts or issues you might be having outside of school. And there's a disproportionate number of students who are LGBTQ plus at the school. So he begins to feel a real sense of community, and his advisors help him realize that there's a whole world out there that is not just the few blocks of Kensington and North Philadelphia. So I eventually go into more depth on his story, but I also try to examine the context, the policy context of the life of Emmanuel, Ryan, and these other children. That what they are enduring and what they are going through did not come about by accident. They're the result, they're the product of decades and centuries of public policies and business decisions and all sorts of practices that produce the conditions of their neighborhoods and their communities. So when I was talking a little bit earlier about the economic conditions that Yvette and Emmanuel had to endure, And one of the policy contexts that I look at is the legacy of welfare reform. In 1996, under President Clinton, welfare reform was passed, which essentially abolished aid to families with dependent children, AFDC, and replaced it with a block grant called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And it also instituted a work requirement, a maximum of 5 years, 60 months on the benefits. There were also some restrictions on who would be eligible for the benefit, the types of things you had to show in order to get the benefit. And then there was a whole apparatus and bureaucracy that was developed when welfare reform was implemented. And what we saw were that millions of people were thrown off of the welfare rolls, in large part due to the punitive work requirements and time limits of benefits. So, for example, in 2008, 2009, for every 100 Pennsylvania families in poverty, only 41%, only 41 participated in TANF, down from 85 who received AFDC in 1994, 1995. So that ratio, that welfare, that poverty to welfare ratio went down starkly during that period of time. And on top of that, you also had a major decline in the purchasing of TANF benefits, because TANF, the program is at $16.5 billion. That number has not shifted at all with inflation over the past past 30 years. And so the purchasing power of those benefits has sharply declined. And so what has been the result of that? So there's been some interesting research examining the effects of welfare reform. You know, when it was passed during an economic boom, you know, the Clinton economic boom in the late 1990s. So some of the nefarious effects of welfare reform were limited because the economy was doing much better. But once that went away with that recession, and as we got closer to the 2008 economic crisis, we saw the deep poverty rate in particular increase markedly for children, especially those being raised by single mothers. And then you have the extreme poverty rate, which is defined as households with children living on less than $2 per person per day. That more than doubled between the beginning of welfare reform to around 2011, 2012. And then if you add in the other indicators, food insecurity and housing insecurity, those are all indicators and conditions that have remained stubbornly high since the passage of welfare reform. Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York was one of the strongest opponents of this bill, as you may recall. He gave a very famous speech on the floor of the Senate, and he said, if in 10 years' time we find children sleeping on grates, picked up in the morning frozen, and asked, why are they here, scavenging, awful to themselves, awful to one another, will anyone remember how it began? Gutting welfare, he said, would surely be the most brutal act of social policy since Reconstruction, and its chief architects will take this disgrace to their graves. The children alone are innocent. Several Clinton administration officials also resigned in protest, among them Peter Edelman, who warned that the law would hurt millions of poor children by the time it is fully implemented and lead to growing homelessness, malnutrition, crime, and other social ills. So this was the context, the policy context for how these children grew up. And I think my book, my research, is one of the most comprehensive studies of children who grew up in the era of welfare reform. What did that do to their bodies, their minds, their spirits, and their educational experiences, and eventually their economic trajectories and aspirations? Closely linked to the issues of economic and educational inequality and insecurity is the crisis of premature death and gun violence. So I would often ask the young people to tell me about their dreams and hopes for the future. And when I talked to Ryan, for example, in particular, he would tell me that he couldn't have even imagined life past the age of 18 or 21. He either thought he was going to be dead or incarcerated. That's the reality that he expected for himself. There was and I'll mention another example. There was a young person who I talked to, and it was his birthday one year. And I asked him, I wished him happy birthday, and I asked him, how do you feel? And he told me, I'm just glad I made it another year. So for a lot of these children in this country, they're not even sure what adulthood looks like or whether it even will exist for them, especially those who are living in neighborhoods and in cities and communities with high levels of premature death, gun violence, and other forms of structural violence. Philadelphia, in particular, has had some of the most deadliest years in its history. During the pandemic and just after the pandemic, there were more than 500 homicides annually, the highest per capita homicide rate among large American cities. In a recent school year, 179 Philadelphia district and charter school students had been shot, and 29 students had been killed. So this is such a grave crisis that exists in Philadelphia and many other places in our country. And I just try to imagine what it's like child to negotiate, avoid, and contest with this level of violence. How your whole life is, and your day-to-day trajectories, how you walk through the street, who you talk to, which streets to avoid, is consumed by how do I keep myself safe, and how that bears on my mind. That you cannot concentrate in school, that you can't even worry about, am I going to get to school on time? Am I going to do well on this test? Am I going to be learning? When you have the burden of worrying about your basic livelihood and safety at all times. Drawing on Paul Farmer's theorizing of structural violence, I argue that poverty is violence itself. And children's lives in Kensington are dominated by that need to avoid violence and neutralize it in any shape or form. So that might mean the violence of stomachs twisting from hunger, the sharp draft striking flesh while bathing in buckets of water, the violence of navigating the hyper-masculine logic of the streets, of navigating navigating those very structures that seek to keep them down. But I argue that these are the shameful failings of the state, not the character defects of children and their families. In Philadelphia, the chances of a child born into a family in the bottom quintile of the income distribution making it to the top quintile was about 1 out of 14. And so the children in Kensington and many neighborhoods have these predestined slots at the bottom of the social and economic hierarchy. A lucky few make it to the top, which gives the impression of a functioning meritocracy. And the violence of this plutocracy, of this oligarchy, it steals childhoods, it crushes dignity, it curses dreams, it pathologizes, stigmatizes, and ultimately reduces communities to a condition of social death. So what must we do? What is the manifesto or the plan of action to repair this suffering, to alleviate this suffering and inequality in so many parts of our country? The first thing I would say is that we can't simply teach or educate the masses out of poverty. It's not simply enough to change the schools. I often cite the words of Jean Onion, who wrote, "We must ultimately, therefore, eliminate poverty. We must eliminate the ghetto school by eliminating the underlying causes of ghettoization. Attempting to fix inner city schools without fixing the city in which they are embedded is like trying to clean the air on one side of a screen door." A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to begin to think about how do we actually reduce the inequalities in this country, when I had the opportunity to work for Senator Bernie Sanders on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. I came in at a time just after the Biden administration had come into office. Democrats had won the House and the Senate. The American Rescue Plan had just been passed. And there was a real possibility, the growing imagination of what might a new country look like, a country based on social democratic principles. And so I would often think back to the children I had met in Kensington. What types of investments do they and their families deserve? What types of resources do they need to thrive in adulthood and beyond? What was the what were the kind of panaceas or the reforms that were needed to uplift their lives and their communities? And we got to work on a piece of legislation called Build Back Better. And Senator Sanders, because he was the chairman of the Budget Committee, he oversaw what was known as a budget reconciliation process, which only requires 51 votes to pass, as opposed to, say, 60 votes. And so I got to work on the child tax credit, tuition-free public college, preschool, libraries, and other programs in this bill. And it really felt like I was following in the footsteps of the architects of, say, the New Deal or the Great Society. That's how momentous this moment felt. And I look back at some of the papers and the articles and writings of the architects of the New Deal, from Roosevelt staffers to LBJ's staffers to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and what were they having to confront? And it was remarkable to think about, in particular, the New Deal. Tens of millions of people unemployed, 1 out of 4 people out of work, an economy at the brink of utter collapse, people lining up in bread lines, fascism on the march in Europe. This was the greatest test of democracy. And FDR recognized that he had to crush the Great Depression in order to save American democracy. And so I think I thought that if he can do it, then certainly we can do it under much less dire circumstances. And so we got to work on this legislation, negotiating with Senate and House Democrats. And we eventually put out a $6 trillion bill, July of 2021. That number was eventually whittled down to 3.5 trillion, which had 48 Democratic senators on board, except Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin. And that 3.5 trillion was eventually whittled down even further to about 1.75, 1.9 trillion dollars. And during each of those reductions, programs got whittled down and hacked away. So eventually the tuition-free community college went away, the housing investments went away, the child tax credit got shrunk down from a 10-year permanent basis to a 1-year extension. There were major reductions, and each of those would eventually change the contours of the bill. And then eventually, I can remember, this was December of 2021. We were almost at the finish line. The bill was almost ready to be passed. The Senate parliamentarian was just about to vet the final pieces of the legislation. And then Senator Manchin goes on Fox News and said, "I can't support the bill. Can't support the bill." And it was a gut punch. We had been working on this bill for 7-8 months. And I thought back to the children in Kensington. That was my first thought. I thought back to what were they going to lose out now? What were those families going to lose out if we fail? And I just remember the kind of stakes that were involved in this. And so, as you know the story, that bill eventually dies, the Build Back Better bill. We get a version of that bill called the Inflation Reduction Act. Still has a lot of really good things in there: climate investment, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, expansion of the Affordable Care Act, capping insulin at $35 a month. Lots of very good things. But a lot of the other programs, the child care program, the elder care, the home health care, the housing investments, preschool, the child tax credit, the paid family and medical leave, all of those programs were kicked out of the bill, thrown out. And that's what was those are the things that were left on the factory floor. And so that was extremely disappointing to think about. And so as we think about where we go from here, and what does the future hold, I would argue that one of the reasons why Democrats lost so profoundly on Tuesday was a direct result of our failure to pass Build Back Better and regulate costs. That if we had passed, say, a childcare bill in 2021, by this point, you would have seen families no longer paying, say, $10,000, $15,000 on childcare. They might be paying 7% of their income, just a couple $1,000s on childcare. At that point, we would have built probably a couple $100,000, tens of thousands, if maybe even more, hundreds of thousands of homes. That would have brought down the cost of rent and the cost of housing, so that more people could buy their first home or move into a more habitable home. Had we passed the child tax credit, people would be able to afford their groceries. People would be able to afford clothing. They'd be able to afford their transportation costs. The effect of inflation on their bottom line would have been much less acute than it would have been without that measure. So I look at those and I look at those kind of cost control measures, and I think that's what I point to as one of the reasons why we weren't able to win on Tuesday. And I also think about how many of the things that were passed, the great achievements of the Biden administration, bipartisan infrastructure bill, fixing our crumbling infrastructure, bridges, roads, tunnels, broadband. Those things take time to develop. People don't see that immediately. They don't see the tangible benefit immediately. The Chips and Science Act, how we're building semiconductor factories all over this country and creating hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs. That takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. Those factories are going to be built over the next 5, 10, 15 years. The Inflation Reduction Act, climate investments, those take time. It's not going to be like tomorrow your energy bills are going to go down immediately. So what many of the policies, really great policies in terms of uplifting workers and unions and working class people, are going to take some time, and people didn't necessarily feel the direct impact of those things. What they felt was the inflation, the cost of the living going up, their grocery bills going up. They saw their childcare costs going up, and they didn't necessarily feel what Bidenomics meant in their daily lives. And so what we have to do from here on out, at least with Democrats and what people who want to reduce the crisis of child poverty, is to recommit to that working class social democratic agenda, to have those investments in childcare, in preschool, in housing, in healthcare, in basic social and economic goods, to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, so that we don't have tens of millions of workers in this country working and earning starvation wages. $8.50 an hour, $9.50 an hour, $10. No way to raise children or family on those figures. So I think that's the first thing we need to do. The second thing we need to do is recommit ourselves to bolstering and rejuvenating the trade union movement. What research has found is that when union membership in this country is high, when more workers are joining unions, that means that inequality goes down, the standard of living goes up, and more people share in the economic pie, that more people can benefit from the economic growth in this country. I often cite the economist Amartya Sen, who argues that poverty is not simply the condition of low income. It is also the deprivation of basic capabilities, which he defined as the substantive freedoms that he or she enjoys to lead the kind of life he or she has reason to value. And so when we talk about building up the trade union movement and investing in those in social and economic goods, we also need to recognize that we need public options in some of those areas, a public option, say in childcare or in housing or in healthcare, so that we don't have to simply rely on the market to deliver all of these basic goods, that we have a competitive situation where where we have a public option competing against, say, a private option, which ultimately reduce costs for all Americans and consumers. So, Washington is going to be in paralysis over the next 2 to 4 years. I think this fight is going to go down to the state level. It's going to be up to states to be bold, to engage in what FDR called bold and persistent experimentation. There's a lot of great work happening at state levels in terms of a state level child tax credit. More than a dozen states now have tuition-free community college. New Mexico and Minnesota have tuition-free 2 and 4-year public colleges and universities. 9 states have universal free school breakfast and lunch on the books. There's a lot of great progress that can be made at the state level, while Washington continues to be mirrored in paralysis and brinkmanship.
Don't forget universal pre-K also.
Of course, universal pre-K, housing investments. I think there's a lot of expanding healthcare to include home-based care or even dental, vision, and hearing. There's so much that I think states could be doing to pick up where the federal government has failed. So in closing, my plea is that the way we move forward is to join social movements, to organize our workplaces, to walk picket lines, to knock on doors, to vote for candidates who champion public goods and act in the service of poor and working class people. Because only when we do that, all of us collectively, then we can create a society where more people are fed and housed and educated and cared for, so that we can ensure a decent life for every American in this country. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So you're not running for office today?
No, not today.
Okay. Okay. Had one comment in the chat I want to read to everybody. This is from Fred. That feeds into what you were talking about. It's been well documented the conditions you were describing are stressful. That stress results in inflammation throughout the body, which predisposes to illness, disease, and which is compounded by poor or no health care. So it's just kind of preaching.
Absolutely. And is there? I can respond to that, or is that?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. No. I think. I mean, it's just very profound. I mean, one issue I'd just bring up is the issue of food and food security. I mean, many of these neighborhoods are food deserts. They don't have access to affordable, nutritious food on a daily basis. And if there are supermarkets or bodegas or poppy stores, as they call them in Philadelphia, the food is often expired or rotting or in terrible quality. And so I'm not surprised that for working parents, people working, say, 1 or 2 jobs with long hours, with limited childcare, they often resort to fast food and other forms of food that is not as nutritious and will ultimately lead to some of the ailments and diseases that afflict poor and working class people more disproportionately than others.
Thank you. Any questions, Paul? We have questions. Come up and get the microphone so people online can hear you. So, come get the microphone, please. I know you know it all.
No, no, that's your shirt. Thank you very much for this
Sure.
presentation. Mike, I kind of heard one sentence of the. No, it's not.
No,
What?
microphones for people online.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll be loud. I'm sorry. I want to ask about the sentence you mentioned at the very end of the summation about Washington will be in paralysis for the next 2-3 years. I almost wish it were so, but I think I'm just wondering why you made that statement, because at the moment, all branches of government are in the pocket of the Republican Party, including Supreme Court. Almost all of House races are called. So why do you think they'll be paralyzed? They have all 3 branches happening in their pocket, basically.
Sure. Yes, what I meant was paralyzed in advancing a social democratic agenda, but certainly committed resolutely to rolling back reproductive rights, eliminating the Department of Education, Head Start, LGBTQ rights. I mean, it will be a wholehearted onslaught on basic rights and freedoms. I mean, there's no doubt about that. We don't know whether or Republicans, so there's still a possibility there. And we also don't know whether Senator Casey in Pennsylvania will eventually win that seat, which gets us to 48 seats. So there's ways I think that can, if there's a couple of Republicans in the Senate, like Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski, and maybe one more, that may be able to stop some of the efforts by repealing the Affordable Care Act. But my sense is, yes, there's going to be paralysis on the social democratic agenda, but certainly full steam ahead on rolling back everything the Biden administration has done. And then certainly just, I would say, the past 50 years, the welfare state has been created over the past 50 years as well.
Right, go ahead for the microphone for the question. Sorry, this is some people online.
I'm going to take it and I'm going to sit down right here. First, I also want to say thank you. I want to say wow, and I want to say thank you for caring enough to write this book and do the work that you've been doing. I haven't personally read the book. I'm still going through a book that I understand this group read before by Matthew Desmond, Poverty by America. But I want to focus on a few things. First, I want to say, I was one of there were those of us out there that were hoping that Kamala Harris would adopt a more populist economic platform in her campaign. It didn't happen, unfortunately. But I want to thank you especially for because I have not read your book. The focus on his name was Emmanuel, the young bisexual man.
Now they go by they.
They, them, yeah. Yes. Because people don't realize, that the gay community, is, people think because they're persecuted that they don't have the isms. They do have the isms, and they're very strong. They have the racism, they have the sexism, they have all of the isms. Gay people of color are marginalized tremendously within the gay community. And to hear you talk about that in the aspect of not only poverty but youth is truly amazing. And I just want to say, from a personal experience, I'm gay. And I also have been living with AIDS for 35 years. And I remember living in Poughkeepsie, New York, which, if any of you know, is a third a city of 25,000, which is a third people of color. And the poverty rate shows that. But I had a doctor who, because she knew I was an activist and an advocate, sat me down and she said, Stephen, without giving names or breaking confidentiality, I have a young man who has AIDS, and he's a person of color, and he's completely isolated. He's isolated not only from his peers, but from his family, who are fundamentalists. And I'm afraid he's going to die alone. And can you help me figure out how to reach this person? And so, talking about suicidal ideation and all of that, it extends all the way down. And without people like that doctor, who recognize this, these people would have nothing, absolutely nothing. And it also points out all of the intersection of the isms, poverty being the bottom, the biggest problem, but then you've got racism, you've got sexism, you've got homophobia, and where they all meet. And that's really hard for people to wrap their heads around unless you're going through it. That said, I'm wondering two things. I also wanted to talk about, you didn't get into, and I'd love to see if you were able to, getting into the being poor and person of color and ableism, the handicapped, the physically challenged, the mentally challenged. You talk a little bit about the criminalization of disruptive behavior in schools that mainly affects people of color and for people of color. And, it's going on like crazy, but specifically, what's going on in terms of people who not only have the challenges of poverty, but then the physical challenge of just getting to school. And then also you mentioned that you were following I'm sorry, it's a lot, but you mentioned you were following the mothers, the single mothers a little bit. Did you at all get to talk, and learn about what their childhoods were like, to get into generational poverty and how generational poverty really drives this also?
Yeah.
So.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate sharing. Maybe I'll start with a couple things. One is your first point around Harrison, economic populism. I was elected a national delegate from Vermont for President Biden, and then we switched over to Vice President Harris. And I certainly agree with you that there's a lot that could have been done on trying to discuss, for example, raising minimum wage, which was not a centerpiece of the campaign, or being more critical of corporate power and the hijacking of corporations, hijacking that corporations have of elections and other institutions, and as well as just basic points around what Trump is going to do about the Department of Education and other anti-public education measures. So I think there's a lot that the campaign could have done more on those to show contrast, and those are issues that directly affect working class people more than, say, what Liz Cheney and Mark Cuban are talking about. So I think there's a little bit of a difference. Anyway, to your point around or thoughts on LGBTQ youth, it is really profound to it was really profound for me to spend time at El Centro because and talk to these kids because they had gone through this constellation of these isms. They had gone through the racism and the classism and the homophobia, as well as the residential segregation and spatial segregation. I'm only allowed to be in certain neighborhoods of the city, and trespassing on certain streets I'm not going to be allowed, or I'm going to be harassed by the police, for example. And it all kind of came together in the lives of these LGBTQ youth. And what I tried to do is examine how unique their experiences were, because that's also a way that children are being pushed out of school, that they are disproportionately criminalized and treated as other than other youth. That's a major piece of the process. Yeah.
And can I just say, you talked about his mother, you just briefly mentioned worrying about him getting AIDS,
Right.
which, in some affluent communities or even middle class communities, it's not that much of a concern. It's a concern, but it's not because of the education works.
Right.
But people don't realize that 4,000 people still die every year from AIDS in this country, and they are disproportionately people of color.
Right.
And women.
Yeah. Sure. Absolutely. No, it's still a major crisis in this country, and so my heart just goes out fully to Emmanuel and Karam, like just what they have to endure for all those years. Just the and I throughout the book I eventually talk about the reconciling that Emmanuel, Karam and Yvette go through, where she eventually accepts them, and that process of understanding what it's like to be queer in America, and how she has to kind of unpack some of her biases or prejudices, and how now they're much closer than they were 10 years ago. And so it does give some hope. And I think the book, while it is certainly a very harrowing tale, and frankly it is very depressing, some of the stories, it is also a very hopeful book to show that there are ways out, that there are that the conditions that exist in these families and in these neighborhoods are not inevitable, that human beings created these conditions. We can also create conditions of of humanity and of livelihood as well. So that's what I hope at the end people will ultimately get to, that if Emmanuel can come out and succeed and do well in adulthood, then perhaps that's a word of encouragement for other queer youth in a similar situation that they were once in.
Another comment, question in the room.
Yep.
This is meant to be a serious question. You went through a litany of all of the things that we should be doing. And the question is, can we afford it? And let me elaborate the question by noting you went through a number of these things that were in the Build Back Better bill, which started out at X number of trillions of dollars, got whittled way down, and eventually did not even pass. But there was another bill that was passed, and we did spend a fair amount of money during the Biden. And the amount that we did spend is widely considered to be a big factor in the inflation spurt that we experienced. So I come back to the question, can we afford to do what you're talking about? And please don't just say we can't afford not to.
No, it's an important question. I would argue to start out. So it was President Trump who enacted some of the first two packages of the COVID-19 stimulus effort. That was President Trump. He's the one who signed those two laws in 2020 and 2020 and 2021, or just at the end of 2020. So if we're talking about any inflation that comes from that, that's on President Trump, I would say. But I would say that what the economists have argued is that a great deal of the inflation came from simply the fact that there were major disruptions in supply chains. That was a major culprit for why prices went up. Has there been price gouging and a role of corporate greed in how prices go up, especially in some particular industries? Absolutely. But I think it's a constellation of factors. Some people would argue that the stimulus checks had some inflationary role. I think it had probably a very limited role. I think the benefits of what the stimulus checks did were literally keep people alive. Many more people would have died in this country had we not passed those stimulus checks. I think there could be an important debate about whether we should have done the second stimulus check. I think it was it was either $1,400 or $600 in 2021. There's an argument whether that was necessary. But I would say that the American Rescue Plan was a major piece of legislation that helped the United States recover fully from the pandemic. The American economy is the most robust economy in the world today because of those original COVID relief packages plus the American Rescue Plan. Unemployment dropped to record lows because of those pieces of legislation. And I think there's going to be a debate in the Democratic Party about whether it was worth getting unemployment so low at the expense of, say, inflation going up a little bit more than it might have. That's a debate I think we should be having. But I think at the very least, we have essentially a full employment economy. We still essentially do because of the decisions that Democrats made in Congress and decisions by President Biden. But I would just point out something about the American Rescue Plan, and in particular, what were known as the temporary expanded child tax credit. That was a measure that was passed in March of 2021. It was rolled out in July of 2021, went up to, I think, 70 million people. Each family with a child, each family received either a $250 or $300 a month check, depending on the age of the child, per child. And what we saw was that dramatically reduced childhood poverty to record lows. We had the lowest childhood poverty rate in the history of this country because of those checks. 3 million children were lifted out of poverty, the miseries of poverty, within those 5-6 months. Food insecurity went down, housing insecurity went down, mental health crises and issues went down, quality of life went up, not just for low-income people, for middle-income people as well. It was a major benefit to both groups of people. And the research shows that that the cost of childhood poverty in this country ranges from $800 billion to $1.1 trillion each and every year. That's money that's automatically taken out of all of our pockets. And so when we make those investments on the front end, which costs a hell of a lot less than those figures, then we're ultimately going to be saving money in the long haul. What we find even on childcare, when we make those investments, those hundreds of billions of dollars investments in childcare, what does that mean? It means that we are actually increasing economic growth. It means that many more parents can rejoin the workforce, particularly women. So it increases employment rates, which ultimately boosts the economy. This is when you make those investments on the front end, we ultimately benefit in the long haul on a variety of metrics. And so when we talk about when you ask the question about can we afford it, absolutely we can afford it, and we can pay for it by making sure that people at the very top are paying a little bit more in tax, that we're increasing, say, the capital gains rate, that we're closing the carriage system so that private equity managers are not paying a lower effective tax rate than people who work for a living, people who actually have to go to work every day and slog through through the day. Those measures would raise us trillions of dollars. And that was in the Build Back Better bill. A lot of those things ultimately didn't make it into the Inflation Reduction Act. But had we done that, that would have raised us trillions of dollars in the long haul. And we're going to come up into a debate next year as the Trump tax cuts expire about what's the direction. What kind of direction do we want for this country? Do we want to continue giving more and more tax breaks to people at the very top? Or do we want to give a tax cut to working and middle income families in the form of an expansional tax credit and other measures? So, I think there's a choice here, and we can afford it as a country. If we were in a situation saying the European countries or another country, I think we would having a different conversation. But we can engage in deficit spending, which ultimately will reduce the debt in the long haul if we make those front end investments.
Couple have another question over here, and how much longer you got?
However long people
Okay,
want
so
to keep asking questions, I'm happy
Let's
to.
keep our questions. Let's keep it to questions now, since we're been here a while. Go ahead.
Okay. To come back to the kids that you studied, I'd be curious a few things. When was it you were talking to them? In other words, what was the situation in the country then? How old were they when you were talking to them? And where did they come to by the time you were done writing your book? What had happened to them, and where are they now?
Yeah.
And do you attribute that to individual factors? Do you attribute that to some good stuff that was going on socially that they were able to take advantage of? I mean, bring us up to date on them.
Sure, absolutely. So I first started going to Kensington in 2015. This is the year before I went to grad school, and when I first went there, I thought I was going to write an article or two about the school, and then I realized that there's actually a much larger story here. And I went off to grad school and then made this I ended up conducting ethnography for my dissertation, and so that's how it began to evolve into a larger project. And so I met these kids around 2015, 2016. Eventually got to meet their parents and relatives over that span. The book project basically, the totality of the book project started from 2015 to when it came out to 2023. So, I've been following them essentially throughout that period. The book does end around just before 2020. I had to find a place to kind of just stop. But I won't spoil the ending, but each of them have, they benefited enormously from the type of education they got at El Centro, and not just the education, but also the opportunity to engage in internship experiences. Ryan would eventually get a job working in the courts because of an internship he had landed through his time at El Centro. they also became much more confident individuals, more confident about their abilities, their intelligence. They learned how to navigate networks and infrastructure in the city. You know, the kids. One remarkable thing about the school is that they exposed the children to neighborhoods outside of North Philadelphia and downtown. These kids rarely ever would venture out of their own neighborhoods. They had no idea what the city of Philadelphia looked like because they never felt safe or secure going into other parts of the city. So the teachers and advisors and the staff at the school would take them to the Philadelphia Art Museum, to the parks, to libraries, to all sorts of opportunities within the city to show them that this city belongs to you just as much as it belongs to me and everyone else. You know, this is and it goes back to that to the kind of the term in sociology by Henry Lefebvre, the French guy, the right to the city. That these children deserve and have and own the right to the city just as much as anyone else. And so I think that those experiences enormously shape them, their aspirations, their confidence, their views on themselves. And then they also built skills and knowledge in that way. I think one of the challenges of the school was that they only spent just about 2 years at the school. So the kind of major learning gaps, especially in reading and math, there was no way you could fully address that while you were just there for such a short period of time. And so, you know, I've been, again, I won't spoil the end, but one area that I think the school could have done better is actually having a clear pipeline into, say, community college, because that's, you know, even if you needed remedial courses in community college, that would have been, I think, a better way to facilitate their life after high school, because that pipeline wasn't as developed as I think it could have been.
Thank you.
Spoiled the
No, I don't want to spoil.
He wants to buy, you need to buy the book. You got another question out here?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Could you your mic up?
Yes, yes.
Certainly.
How's that?
In front of your mouth.
Okay,
Thank you.
how's that?
We'll find out.
Is that better?
It'll work.
Okay.
I just want to bring it back quickly to talking about well, I can't remember the bill, but talking about the emergency economic stimulus during the COVID crisis, the very effective emergency anti-poverty programs. And interesting because they're starting to be able to study the results of that now.
Right.
And one thing they found out, a question that I found fascinating that they were even asking was, what did people do with the money once they paid their necessities? What did they do with money that they had left over? And they found out that they did things like held off for a better job that paid better. They went back to school. They decided that spending more time with their family was more important than working 2 or 3 jobs. These are all interesting questions that people in poverty don't often get to address. So I just wanted to point that out. But
And if I might just say, even just things like taking the family out to eat,
exactly.
or going to an amusement park, just simple pleasures of life that they
Yep.
they hadn't been able to afford their children.
Exactly. And it goes to, I mentioned the book I was reading by Matthew Desmond. He talks about unfettered capitalism, and he talks about how capitalism in general creates an economics of scarcity instead of an economics of prosperity. And I think we need to include that in our narrative much more. We need to change the narrative. And then I just wanted to point out that you also talk about, what can we do in our communities to combat this, especially around youth. And in Glens Falls in particular, the high school there recognized years ago that they had probably the poorest of the poor in their community going to school, homeless children that were living with their families in cars or on couches. And they created 2 positions, resource personnel, that dealt specifically with this population extracurricularly and curricularly. Their job is to, and we're talking a city of 14,000 people, if they can do it, that is just to address the needs of these children, to make sure that they can get as normal an educational experience and environment as possible, and it's working wonders.
Yeah. Yeah, it goes to the model of community schools, that schools are the anchors of the community, that we should be integrating social and health supports within schools themselves. One of the models I often point to is the Cincinnati Public Schools, where they converted all of their schools into community learning centers. They have a dentist in the school. They have a school based pediatrician. They have mental health counselors. They have universal preschool meals, summer and after school programs, and not just summer and after school programs, but transportation to get the kids to the after school programs. So like there are some very incredible schools around the country that have recognized that the issues that children bring to school every day don't just get left behind. They get carried into the classroom.
And there are some models of Hudson Headwaters Health Network, which is a large health provider out there, rural health network. They have a very strong program where they actually have local buses that bring dentists to school.
Right.
So, I think thanks much for your input. We're looking for questions, not, if you want to have a discussion, we can do that after the Q&A. Are there any more questions now? I think we're done.
Great.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Now we just need to get everyone to get on board with making life better for everybody.
No, thank you so much.